John McWhorter.
Hey, Glenn Loury, how are you doing?
Doing well. Welcome back to the Glenn Show, John. Happy to be talking with you. You're supposed to be a regular, but it seems a long time since we've had a conversation.
No, I think we didn't. We do it about 3 weeks ago. I think we did.
Okay.
Definitely not more than a month, but we don't do it often.
I do think we did it in January. That's right. I was in Texas. I recall now the conversation. It's almost
right.
It's almost exactly a month. 4 weeks, not 3. But we don't do it enough. It's true, and here we are. And people have expectations of us, John.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're waiting to be, I don't know what, mortified, humored.
Well, I think that's right. And
stimulated,
enlightened is what
enlightened. Okay.
So
let's see if we can live up to the rep.
So what are we gonna enlighten about today?
Well, being the black guys, or at least amongst the black guys at blockingheads.tv, I thought one thing we might do is just kick around a bit our reactions to a symposium that the New York Times had on its maybe 10 days ago or so on its web-based edition on the question of the responsibilities of black intellectuals. Room for debate.
This is the Room for Debate series.
The Room for Debate series, and the topic of the day a week, 10 days ago, was do black intellectuals need to talk about race? Mm-hmm. And a number of individuals, relatively prominent younger African-American scholars and writers were featured offering their views. Mm-hmm. And, you know, you and I being black, being intellectuals, being pundits, and being people who are often heard to speak critically and more or less insightfully about race matters, you know, we might have had something to say about that question.
Well, yeah.
That's what I wanted to put the question to you, John. Do black intellectuals need to talk about race? And I wanted to get your reaction to the musings of the several black intellectuals. Perhaps I should mention it's Eddie Glaude of Princeton, Carl Hart of Columbia University, Melissa Harris Perry, who has an MSNBC television show, as well as her appointment at Tulane University, Khalil Muhammad, who is the director of the Schomburg Center of the New York Public Library and a historian and academic, and Stephen Alexander, who's a physicist at Dartmouth College. All of them offer their views about this, and we are going to offer our views about their views and so forth. That's what I thought we'd do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. I met Stephen last summer, and I think that as far as black intellectuals go, there should be, I would hope there'd be two kinds. There should be the kind that actually does things that have nothing to do with being black, and I think that's because, and this is something that Neil deGrasse Tyson has said, which is that you're doing your duty in part by just showing the world and showing America that black people can do what everybody else does. And that is extremely valuable. And so for Neil deGrasse Tyson to be doing his astrophysics and for that to have nothing to do with the black condition, I think is very important, because to the extent that all or most black intellectuals are primarily, maybe not only, but primarily focused on black issues, it makes it look like we don't have the scope or that we don't have the native interest in anything else. And that's not what anybody was looking for when we were trying to overcome. Then there should be the other kind, which is the kind that is concerned with the black condition. But Eddie Glaude's idea that to be concerned properly with the black condition as an intellectual is to be a leftist and to be urging basically that society do things completely differently than it has, I think is one of those things where it feels good to say it, and you can always get a certain part of the room applauding, but it's a very limiting view of what it is to be a black person concerned with their own race. There can be, and I'm not just going to say there can be black conservatives, especially since I'm not one, but what about being a black liberal who, very much like Barack Obama, works very much within the structure as it is and has what they consider to be realistic dreams? I didn't see that in what he said in his lead statement. What did you think?
Well, I would take your point a little bit further. I mean, first of all, let me summarize what I take to be your point. You say we need people who are black and who excel in intellectual work, but who are not focused specifically on black issues, by way of making the point that African American intellectual life is as expansive, as enriched, as deep, and profound as any other, and isn't merely defined by reacting to the conditions in which African Americans may happen to find ourselves at this point in time. I agree very strongly with that. You say, too, that amongst those African American intellectuals who do elect to address themselves in a substantive way to the political and social and policy and cultural, historical and whatnot, aesthetic, whatever concerns that are raised by the African American condition, they shouldn't be thinking of themselves only as on one end of the political spectrum. One can responsibly follow one's intellectual vocation and discharge one's communal responsibilities while at the same time having a view about political matters and ideological posture that is centrist or even right of center, just as well as left of center. Do I understand you correctly?
That is exactly what I meant.
Okay. Well, as I say, I strongly agree with the view. In fact, have hoped in my own personal career to have exemplified the practice of addressing myself as an intellectual, as a scholar, in my case as a professional economist, to a range of matters that go far beyond the concerns of African Americans or issues of domestic social policy or questions about racial discrimination or whatever it might be. I mean, my own work, I think, has exemplified that. And of course, that's important. Although I might say, is it really still necessary to make a show of what should be obvious to any reflective person, which is that skin color has little or nothing to do with intellectual capacity, range, depth, interest, or whatever. So the fact that I need to solve equations like the ones on the blackboard behind me here in order to make a point to, I don't know who, my students, my colleagues, or readers of the New York Times or whatever, that black people can solve equations, strikes me as, let's say, a relic of another era. We ought to be past black people having to put on shows so that other people will say, oh, they can run a military division. They can, be the chief executive or chief financial officer of a corporation. Oh, they can try antitrust suits with effect in federal court, and they can even get themselves elected president of the United States, and they can win Nobel Prizes in hard subjects and so forth and so on. I thought we ought to be past that point. But anyway.
Yeah, I think we're getting further. I would have said 20 years ago there's still an aching need to demonstrate to everybody what black people can do. I don't know what the official signs would be that things have changed, but there is much less of it. I mean, just in terms of something that's related, although not the same thing, black affluence. Remember in the 90s there was the book Our Kind of People, written by Lawrence, oh Lord, I forgot his last name because I had insomnia last night and I'm just having a blank. Lawrence something. He is a black journalist and he wrote about the old-time black bourgeoisie and the cotillions that they had and the Jack and Jill clubs. And the media made a big deal out of the idea that they're black people with a lot of money who go on fancy vacations. It happened again around 2001 when Stephen Carter, the black law professor at Yale, started writing novels, and he wrote a mystery novel populated by affluent black people. And the media went nuts over the idea that white people don't know, and this is the mainstream media, white people didn't know there were black people like that. That's now another time. I think especially with the whole Obama era, nobody is particularly surprised to find out that they're black people who know which wine goes with chicken. B. Smith is no longer a novelty. And in the same way, I think that people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, and I would humbly say that I'm making a little dent in that in my linguistics work, which generally has nothing to do with race, and there are a whole lot of other people, are showing that you can be black and you can be just a geek. And so I do think that that is changing, but I don't know if we're completely there yet. I'll be interested to admit when we have. The new generation, I think, are much more open to it. Undergraduates at Columbia, I don't sense most of them are surprised that I'm black American and teaching them linguistic things that have nothing to do with race. But people a little older, I'm not sure.
Well, John, I want to reiterate my view that whatever the reactions people may have to African Americans doing this or that, from the point of view of what's good for our souls, so to speak, anticipating how people are going to understand our activity so as to dispel this or that stereotype about our group is just not good for the soul. You know, I mean, let's just go and do our thing. Let's stop looking over our shoulder and keeping account of, you know, how many people have noticed and what it is that they want to think about that. But anyway, that's just my view. But I wanted to react to the second part of what you were saying, which was this business of a, you know, sort of eclectic and broad-based ideological spectrum informing African-American intellectual work, or how it would be desirable for that to be the case, or how some people who, like one of the commentators in this symposium, who claim that, you know, if you're going to address yourself to social issues or political issues as an African-American intellectual, you have the obligation to be to the left of center, criticizing the establishment from the left. I think that is very, very wrong, and I say that as someone who thinks of myself as being at least somewhat, on most questions, left of center. I mean, I think it's wrong, first because there needs to be, I think there's value in having a robust debate amongst African Americans about unions, teachers' unions, quality of public education for inner city kids or whatever, about social policy, welfare, minimum wage, healthcare reform. Is it just obvious that a more expansive, easier to get disability, longer unemployment benefits, more money available to persons who are not able to take care of their children with the money that they can earn in the labor market, is it obvious that that's good for African Americans? Is it obvious that raising the minimum wage, $5 an hour, $10, why not $20 an hour? Why not $30 an hour? Is it obvious that that's good for African Americans? So it's not obvious, in my view, that all of these policies are uniformly in the interest of disadvantaged people, or people who are relatively on the margins of society, or people who are confined to the least productive districts or the least prosperous districts of the cities, and so forth and so on. How about making it even tougher? What about crime, punishment, prisons, and policing? Is it obvious that stop and frisk is not in the interest of African Americans? Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not declaring that the minimum wage is bad for black people, that welfare ought to be cut in the interest of blacks, that unemployment benefits being extended hurts the African American population. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that stop and frisk policing is a good thing. What I'm saying is the answer to these questions is not at all obvious. It's likely to vary over time and place. It's likely to depend upon particular historic conditions, and it's an answer that's likely to change through time. I think views about teachers' unions and the interest of the black community in 2013 probably look a lot different than they would have looked to most observers in 1983 or 1973. And therefore, intellectuals whose responsibility it is to parse these matters, to study them, to argue about them, to analyze them, and so forth, need to open their minds. I mean, to just be slavishly nested within a left-of-center ideological spectrum, unreflectively so, about these matters is, in my view, doing a disservice to the community that you're supposed to be serving.
I would agree, and for a specific reason. You're definitely right. There's an idea that there's no question that to be a serious and admirable black thinker, you're supposed to be left of center. And I would add, lefter. Liberal is Obama, and the idea is that his feet need to be held to the fire. He's been a disappointment. We're supposed to be prophets speaking from the hard left, or there's something wrong. We've been co-opted in some way. That is extremely damaging, not only because it's unintellectual in its way. As you're saying, it doesn't examine the ins and the outs and the details and the changing historical context. It's really just a kind of a gesture, I think, based partly in probably a sense that our job is to be Jesus's, and I think that the role of Christianity in black American life plays some role in it. But I think also it's extremely disempowering and dispiriting, because what it implies is that black Americans are the only people who have ever existed in this country, or really on earth, who require perfect or maybe near perfect conditions to succeed. The idea seems to be that until there is virtually no injustice, until there's a virtually level playing field, and notice I'm trying not to caricature, but the idea is that until we turn everything upside down, we and we alone can only be expected to do so much. And to me, the idea that to be an intellectual worth their salt is to espouse that position is just backwards. I suspect that people who are espousing that position often are doing it for reasons that are as much emotional as empirical. The idea is that you are always on the side of the angels, you always have the special insight. But the problem is I just don't see how it helps people in the real world. And sometimes when I've said this, I've gotten a certain interesting response that seems to come from the black academic sort, especially the younger ones, which is that they seem to think that I'm saying that I think everyone should be like me. It's the oddest interpretation. It seems to be they think I'm saying I'm middle class and I've always done this, that, and the other thing, so just be like me and everything will be fine. And that has nothing to do with it. We're talking about how to lift people out of poverty. But the fact that they would come up with that shows what you're saying, that there's a lens that these people are looking at things in. They can't imagine thinking their way out of a certain box, which is that to be a serious black thinker is to be a man or woman of the left. Very limiting, not true, doesn't help people. It really needs a rethinking, and I think we have to all just be brave enough to understand that in 2013 we can start doing that kind of thinking.
Okay, so we got two different axes here, it seems to me. One of them is about left and right, and the other is about, which is an ideological axis, and the other is about communal responsibility, or a kind of autonomy and independence from communal responsibility. Why should I be thought of as a black person? Why should I think of myself primarily as a black person? Which is about identity, belonging, communal responsibility, and so on. And I think so far we've been talking about the political axis in the world of African American intellectuals, the fact that many, perhaps most, cluster left of center, and the fact that both for existential reasons, that is living a decent and admirable life and satisfying life, and for reasons of policy effectiveness, it might be a good thing for there to be diversity. It would be a good thing, definitely a good thing for there to be diversity. But what about this other axis, this axis of, okay, I just happen to be black. Why is any communal responsibility, why am I inheriting any responsibility as a result of that? I mean, why does it matter? I mean, not only should I not have to be a mascot or a role model or an exemplar in everything that I do, worried about how people will perceive African Americans through their perception of me, but beyond that, shouldn't I be free? I mean, free from an expectation or an obligation? I mean, why do I have to respond to a black student who comes into my office looking for guidance in the world? Why do I have to write a letter to the editor in response to the last silly article that I saw in the newspaper saying something stereotypic about African Americans? That sort of thing. I'm wondering if you have any sympathy for this impulse that I have to just want to be relieved of the, black man's burden.
Oh, of course. I mean, the truth of the matter is, race issues are very important. I wouldn't have jumped in if I didn't think they were. But it's only one thing. And if you are somebody, I don't usually apply the word intellectual to myself, but I definitely think of myself as a thinking person and a kind of a readaholic. If that's what you are, it almost surprises me how comfortable many people are doing just the race thing. And many of them would object, that's not all I do. But if it's 95% of what you're known for and what you produce, then that's all you're doing. And I just think, no, there's got to be more stuff, which is why I do other things as well. And then, of course, you do have the kind of black intellectual who really just only does what they do, and they're not going to do the race thing. And I think there's a tendency to think that those people have stepped outside, that there must be something attitudinal, that the movement must be vertical. They must think that they're better, or they're stepping around race issues because they don't want to get stuck in it. When really, it might just be that they're a good old-fashioned nerd. And it's interesting, I really do think that 50 years ago, that person would have been seen as less peculiar than that person is seen by some people now. The idea of, I remember there was one of the many things, there were really about 6 or 7 things that happened in the media or in the United States that got me, stepping outside of my linguistics orbit into the race debate. And one of them was this debate between Henry Louis Gates and Manning Marable in the Times in what would have been, I think, 1998, where Manning Marable was saying that it is the responsibility of black intellectuals to study the black condition. And I remember thinking, that is not a debate that would have been as likely in, say, 1958. The idea would have been, can't we black people just be people? Let me study physics. Let me study ancient Greek like all of you. And that was considered fine. We live in very different times. And it's interesting to me. I think we're moving into a different place. There are so many students I see around here at Columbia, for example, who are black American, who are just studying any old thing, and very quickly they're going to be grown-ups.
Yeah, no doubt there's a generational shift in the dimensions of racial identity and people's self-understanding about that. I see it, of course, in contrast with my children, who are several decades younger than me. They're African Americans, but they wear their race identity very lightly indeed, much more lightly than I ever did.
Yeah.
But I want to shift the discussion a little bit, John, and bring President Obama and his achievement of being elected and reelected as president, the first African American president, back into the picture here. Because one of the themes in this commentary in the room for debate discussion that the Times had about the role of black intellectuals was the observation that some people who are writing and speaking now about public matters as African American intellectuals are in one way or another slavishly supportive of or apologetic for the president because he's a black president and one has to be a cheerleader for our black president. Mm-hmm. And I'm not without sympathy for that kind of criticism because I think that notwithstanding what I just said, which is I want to be free, please don't shackle me with the black man's burden that I have to comment on every black thing, this or that or this or that. I still feel that the legacy of African American political and intellectual struggle in the country leaves us with a responsibility to stand for something, and that something is in some way or another, if not left of center, then nevertheless critical of the presumptions of, American exceptionalism, American hegemony, American military dominance, American superiority, or whatever. Mm-hmm. So, somehow I want to say here that because my ancestors had to struggle against, American apartheid, American domestic terrorism against people because of the color of their skin, American discrimination and Jim Crow and so forth, and overcome it, that we know deep in our bones that the hype about American exceptionalism is blemished. It's just not quite as people would have it. Mm-hmm. And then to become cheerleaders for the American enterprise, whatever it might be, secondarily because we are cheerleaders for the president of the United States, who happens to be a black man, and to abandon this skeptical and critical stance. Oh no, the secret legal memo authorizing the president to create on his own account without any judicial review kill lists, which he can then execute through the military apparatus of the country to eliminate people whom he understands to be enemies of our state. Without any review or any accountability, a position that would have and should have triggered, rightly would have triggered a deep critical reaction from African American intellectuals if it had been enunciated by a, if you will, white president. Mm-hmm. Goes unremarked on MSNBC by the likes of Melissa Harris Perry, who holds herself forward. I give her as one example. Others could be given. Al Sharpton could also be given. Holds herself forward as a spokesperson for this great tradition of African American struggle and social criticism, but can't find it within herself to vigorously evoke that tradition in criticism of a president who's overstepped his legal and moral bounds. This kind of thing. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting take on it because, of course, those are certainly important claims, and there are people who are held back from what they would say if, say, John Edwards or Bill Clinton were doing the same things out of a sense of cultural fellowship, and also out of a sense, which I think is outdated, that if they criticize Barack Obama, then they are giving entree to, say, Republicans/white people to do the same thing, and there's a sense that somehow that's unleashing some sort of uniquely poisonous force, and pretty soon people are going to start calling him the N-word, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas I'm not sure where people still have this idea that Obama can't take care of things himself and buck himself up against criticism, and that, you know, black people in general can have mean things said to them and still walk on. There's certainly that. However, I think that when it comes to something like what Eddie Glaude said in the Times piece, I think that if Barack Obama had somehow, in some fantasy world, instated a new Great Society program, that's what they're talking about. What they mean is a revolution to fight poverty and to turn America upside down in that way. If he did that, then as far as they were concerned, he would walk on water no matter what else he did. What they're saying when they say we have to hold the president's feet to the fire is they were waiting for him to reinstate what started under Lyndon Johnson. And to the extent that he didn't do that, although it'd be hard to say how he possibly could have, or exactly what would have worked, given what a mess the Great Society ended up being. Short of that, you're not doing the right thing. And that bothers me, because I think that idea that we have to not like what he's doing because he's not being a hard leftist and transforming the housing projects, it just doesn't make sense to me. It seems that it's more based on how good it feels to fashion yourself as a prophet than to really engage with the way the world is. But yeah, you're right. And I'm guilty of some of it myself. There is an extent to which I have always given Obama a somewhat longer tether, not because I'm afraid white people are going to be mean to him, but out of a fellow traveler sense that I want the man to do well. I openly admit that there's some of that in me, and I think there's more of it in others.
Well, let him do well. Let him do well. I want him to do well, too. I'm all for him doing well. However, I don't know if you're right in saying that much of the reaction from the black intellectual classes to the president is driven by their dissatisfaction, a negative reaction to his domestic policy, the timidity of his domestic policy. That may or may not be right. Mm-hmm. But what I want to say is that I think that pales in significance to the questions about foreign policy and about the use of force and about the posture of the United States and the global situation.
I would agree.
Whether it be in South Asia or in the Middle East or in Africa or whatever. Whether it be about nuclear weapons or about the use of force in various situations, or about the war on terror or whatever. Pales in significance. And I think that if you're for the underdog, if that's the position that many people who understand themselves to be black intellectuals are going to embrace, that means more than just, I want to see better conditions for people at the bottom of American society. It means that I want to think carefully about the asymmetric circumstance of the powerful nations in the world vis-a-vis those who are much less powerful. I want to think about how we throw our weight around. I want to think about the presumptions of the relative value of human life of someone who happens to be a member of the United States military forces deployed in a theater of combat, and someone who happens to be a civilian resident of a village somewhere where the collateral damage might befall them and they could be wiped out by a drone attack. And you're for the underdog, and yet you never get around to questioning whether or not your black president's conduct of the affairs of state are consistent with the values of somebody who would be for the underdog viewed in global perspective. Don't you have an obligation, if you're coming out of a history of repression and discrimination and domination, to think hard about your responsibilities and your relative current freedom toward those in the world who continue to be repressed, dominated, and mistreated, sometimes by your own government.
So, Glenn, you're imagining a young black political scientist who does hundreds of interviews with CIA officials and Navy SEALs and goes abroad and interviews various Pakistani officials, etc., and writes a book about our drone program and how unjust it is and how we are betraying America's ideals. I swell at the thought of that person. But I also know that somewhere along the line, that person would go to a conference and be genially asked over a glass of wine why they were so concerned with what was happening to people in Pakistani villages as opposed to their brothers and sisters here in the United States in the lesser neighborhoods of Newark and Chicago. There would be a sense that what they were doing was not really black. And I think you know what I mean. And I think that that is a sign that we still haven't gotten there yet. Because, of course, there should be some black people studying the projects of Chicago. But the idea that a black person who was more interested in what was going on in New Guinea or who was interested in looking at oppression in China is somehow stepping outside of their duty, and it's very much there. Nobody would put it in so many words, but it would be there. That's a sign that we have not completely overcome, depending on what we mean by overcome, I think. Yeah, you're right.
I want to get okay, John, I want to get and we're getting to the end of our talk, get your reaction to something. So Cornel West and Tavis Smiley. Mm-hmm. All right, so these are black intellectuals. Cornel West, a professor at Princeton, Tavis Smiley, a media personality, an entrepreneur, and they've been critical of President Obama and have been criticized for their criticism. They have launched a poverty tour where they've gone around the country and tried to use their celebrity to draw attention to the plight of people at the bottom. And they've done other things besides. I remember catching one of the Tavis Smiley shows maybe less than 2 years ago, I think, which was broadcast from China. He and Cornel West had gone to Beijing and were in some school with a classroom full of Chinese young people, asking them questions and getting their answers and responses and having a colloquy with them. And I was stunned by it, by the juxtaposition, of Brother Cornel and Tavis Smiley and all of their African-American-ness on the one hand, with what was a room full of, adolescent Chinese young people who were aware of what's going on in the world to some degree and very ambitious and quite smart and speaking English very well. And I thought it was just a wonderful thing. And I generally think that I admire what Tavis Smiley and Cornel West are doing, and I'm wondering whether you share that view and whether they exemplify something good about the practice of black intellectual whatever.
And we've discussed Cornel West before. I think that to the extent that they've billed what they're doing a poverty tour rather than a Save the Black People tour, I think that it is admirable, although I've always sensed that it was also pragmatic. I think they sensed that the era when you could make it about black people only has passed, and so they wanted to make it more palatable by making it about poverty, and maybe for it to attract more support. However, if we're going to use this word intellectual and in terms of thinking things up and thinking about new things, what I've been disappointed with those two and this tour is the lack of specifics. And I'm not expecting them to come up with detailed policy papers, but if the idea is that we're going to attack poverty, we are going to attack the amount and the nature of poverty in this society, give me 3 things, and not just boring generalities like, improve educational opportunities, but 3 innovative ideas, like TED Talk innovative ideas that could really help and point us to the way. And I don't see any interest in that in them. I think that the main idea with both of them is this profit business. It's the idea that you must be the person who's enlightened enough to understand that even our Jesus Christ Obama is tainted and corrupted and that we need a change and they're going to lead the way. Well, if you're going to lead the way, tell us how, or else I think that ultimately what you're really doing is having a kind of a tantrum and enjoying looking right. And I know that's probably not fair, but until I hear a little bit more from the poverty tour than there are too many poor people, I need more. How about you?
Yeah, I don't think that's fair. I think what Tavis would say if he were here is, I got a list of 16 things Congress needs to pass. And then it would look pretty much like your left of center liberal wish list about what kind of law should be enacted, how tax policy should be changed,
Mm-hmm.
how domestic priorities should be reoriented, how the relative emphasis on military should be de-emphasized. I mean, I'm sure he could come up with specifics. It might not be anything brand new or, path-breaking or revolutionary. It might be your conventional,
like his book,
progressive.
what was it called, The Covenant?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, right. He's put forth.
I'm saying it's not as if there's no there. There's no surprises there, though.
Mm-hmm. And no. What I missed in, for example, that book was how you would actually get this going in the world we live in. Like there was a mantra in it, something along the lines of "Hold your representatives responsible."
Yeah.
How? What are you going to not vote for them if they don't do what you want them to do? No, I didn't see any pragmatics.
No, I agree, and that's going to be the president's answer, and the people who support him. Politics is the art of the possible. Did you see what happened in the first term with our ambitious legislation? We barely got the stimulus thing through. We barely got the health care thing through. Cap and trade died without ever being really mentioned, and we got resistance across the board, and we got a 2010 setback that was something. And, we're getting done what we can get done. We got ourselves reelected, and if you look at the overall thing, we haven't done that badly. If you want more, you better give me a viable strategy for how to get it.
Right.
So
that is where I think I would like it to be. And until then, I see a kind of theater, and we've had enough theater.
Are we not part of that theater ourselves, John McWhorter? Do we not occupy a kind of ironical position vis-a-vis that theater as those who stand outside of it and who create our audience by being willing to criticize the action on the main stage?
Not as long as we're trying to write about concrete solutions, and I think both of us try to do that. At least I hope we do.
All right, fellow black intellectual, John McWhorter. Whatever. Nice talking with you.
Glenn, good talking to you too, and
Okay.
talk to you next time after the State of the Union.
You bet. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.